Thank you for standing by, and welcome to the Energy Industry Team Web Conference Series. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. I must advise you that this conference is being recorded today, January 27, 2011. I would now like to hand the conference over to your speaker for today, Ms. Jennifer Bartz. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Bartz with Foley and Lardner, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the Energy Industry Team Briefing Series. The title of today's program is Massachusetts SRECs, the Massachusetts RPS Solar Carve-Out Program Explained. Joining us today from Foley is partner Jeff Atkin and associate Bill DeFore. From the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources are Natalie Andrews, Renewable Energy Project Coordinator, and Michael Judge, RPS Solar Carve-Out Program Coordinator. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Jeff Atkin.
So, thanks a lot, Jennifer. Again, this is Jeff Atkin. I know many of the folks on the call and attending on the webinar. Bill DeFore and myself are from Foley. We both work in the Renewable Energy Group. I'm a partner that kind of, and in fact, both of us cover most parts of renewable energy development. I chair our solar energy practice. We have around 90 attorneys in the energy practice group and just over 30 that are in our solar practice. Bill kind of, prior to coming to Foley, he worked at the Department of Energy and has been pretty much going full-time with us in the solar space. I'll give a little background on Michael as well and Natalie. They can get a little more detail on their background, and we'll cover some housekeeping and a little overview. Mike, he's worked at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources for just over a year, and prior to that, he worked in the solar rebate program at the Clean Energy Center. Natalie has also worked at the Massachusetts Department of Energy for just over 3 years, and she focuses on solar policy and on the RPS program. So just a little bit about a little housekeeping. The presentation is going to be probably just under an hour. There is a Q&A tab on the webinar. Let's get started on the tab up top, just kind of in the middle. You can type in some questions. We'd already received some questions earlier as well. And at the end of the program, we'll go over, to the extent we have time, those questions and answers. And if we don't get to them, we'll get back individually to the people that asked the question. The program is going to be recorded. It will be on our website and available after. It usually takes about a week or so for it to get up. If you need any audio assistance, just press #0, and we can have a technician that will help you out. As far as Foley, I gave a little background on us. We're a thousand attorney firm, 21 offices worldwide. And a pretty big group of us. This is even 85 plus here. I think we're over 90 now that focus on energy and really all aspects of it. In Massachusetts, particularly, we've done several projects on the solar side already, and have seen many more kind of coming down the pipeline. One of the reasons why, with Mike and Natalie, we decided to put this webinar together. So as far as the organization of the webinar today, we're going to first go over, and Bill will go over a quick overview of solar development and SREC trends. Then Mike and Natalie will jump into a more detailed review of the Massachusetts Solar Carve-Out Program, and we'll finish with 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So with that, Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in today. We definitely have a lot of information to cover, but I think it'd probably be worthwhile to spend a few minutes just describing some basics and some general trends that we're seeing in the solar market throughout the U.S. On this first slide here, just want to provide a few general definitions. I'm sure it's review for many of you, but you'll hear us use the acronym RPS, RECs, SRECs. In terms of RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard, it's a state regulation and requires utilities to use renewable energy or renewable energy credits to account for a certain percentage of their retail electricity sales. Now, within the RPS, certain states have a specific provision referred to as a solar carve-out or a solar set-aside. And that provision requires utilities to use solar energy specifically or solar renewable energy credits, SRECs, to account for a certain percentage of their retail electricity sales. Just to point out one note on that, the solar carve-out is a specific portion of the RPS. It's not in addition to the RPS. So if we take a look on this map, it'll give you a general sense of the various RPS policies from state to state. One thing to notice about this, there is no general kind of national standard, despite talks and attempts to craft one. For those of you who tuned into the State of the Union address the other night, that was definitely a topic that the President brought up, but we're not there yet. So what we have now is what's in front of you, and that is different regulations in different states. One thing to notice is that some states have enacted standards while others are merely goals, and the goals, in general, lack the teeth or enforcement power that standards have. And if you just kind of briefly peruse the different numbers and percentages, you'll see a lot of the RPS numbers in the 20 to 30% range, but note that the years to achieve those numbers vary greatly. In California, for example, where Jeff and I are right now, our goal is 33% by the year 2020. And if you look at Massachusetts, on the far right-hand corner, their goal is 22.1% by 2020. You'll notice there in the box for Massachusetts that there's a breakdown of the 22.1%. I'm going to let Natalie and Mike explain how Massachusetts' RPS is broken down later in the presentation, because they have a really neat chart that kind of explains the breakdown. So if we drill down a little further, on this next chart, you see states that have RPS policies with solar carve-out provisions. On the previous slide, there were 29 states that currently have an RPS, and you see on this slide, 16 of those 29 have some form of a solar carve-out. Now, if you look here on this chart, you'll notice that the carve-out provisions vary. Some are percentages, others are numerical goals, and some are multipliers. For example, if you look at Michigan, in the state of Michigan, 1 megawatt of solar electric energy generated is counted as 3 megawatts toward the state's RPS. We have it delineated there as triple credit. One other thing to note on this chart, you will notice that California does not have a solar carve-out, to the chagrin of many of us, but that's probably a topic for a different day. So just in terms of general trends, general U.S. trends, a couple things to briefly note. There is certainly an increasing focus being placed on SRECs as a financial incentive. I think what we've seen is many states are moving toward the SREC model to focus on a model that's based on the production of clean energy, whereas kind of the traditional rebate model is based on reimbursing costs incurred. But SRECs are really focused on generation. And in some, SRECs are being viewed as a more viable mechanism for states to achieve their RPS goals. Point number 2, direct solar incentives remain important and continue to evolve. A couple things of note that just happened before year-end 2010. I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of it, but bonus depreciation for qualified energy property was extended and expanded. And, lo and behold, in the 11th hour, The Section 1603 cash grant program was extended for another year. Section 1603 has been the darling of the renewable energy world since it came about. We've worked extensively on all the issues surrounding that. But all to say, there are certainly other incentives alive and well. The third note I just want to make is that progress continues to be made on legal incentives, legal issues surrounding third-party PPAs. And basically the issue there is, in the third-party PPA model, the developer builds and owns the PV system and then sells the power to the customer. Well, the issue is whether the third-party owners are deemed to act as monopoly utilities, competitive suppliers, or both, which depends on kind of the degree of market deregulation. But to combat that, states like Colorado and New Mexico and California have legislatively determined that third-party owned systems are exempt from Public Utility Commission regulation. And you'll see that on this next slide here. This slide shows in yellow the states that have authorized third-party PPAs. As I mentioned, deemed these contracts to not be subject to Public Utility Commission regulation. So I think you're going to see this map will look differently for sure in another year or so, but progress is being made on that front. And just a couple notes to make about general SREC trends. There's certainly an increasingly sophisticated market involvement from the states. I think that the Massachusetts program is evidence of that trend. Policymakers are starting to understand that net metering policies play an important role in creating markets for on-site renewables, and those policies need to evolve as the markets expand. The second point is just increased price transparency for SRECs. For example, as we're going to discuss today, there's a clearly defined alternative compliance payment, there's a defined price floor, and data is frequently available from aggregators and third-party sellers. And that leads to the third point, which is just, there are plenty of web-based forums and companies that are specializing kind of in this trade, connecting SREC buyers and SREC sellers. And so I think this next slide, SRECs in Vogue, gives you just a general sense of SREC markets in other states. You see everyone from Arizona and Nevada, which you would expect, to states like New Hampshire, Delaware, and Massachusetts, which you might not necessarily expect. But I just point you to the far right column, which shows kind of the variability in SREC prices. They're definitely vary from state to state. And all to say that there are a couple factors that drive the value of SRECs. A huge part is just the state policies, state incentives, and obviously natural supply and demand forces. And then SRECs themselves are generally sold in two ways. Very common way is through long-term fixed price contracts. That's where the owner will enter into a multi-year fixed price contract to sell the SREC for a fixed price. I think the upside to that and the attractiveness of that is that it provides a predictable stream of cash flow, and it does take a measure of variability out of the SREC sale process. The downside in a long-term contract is that option shifts the price variation to the purchaser, and as a result, the prices offered by the purchaser could be perceived as being below market. In other words, the project owner may feel like in entering the long-term contract, they may be leaving some money on the table. So that's the long-term contract option. second popular way is just through the spot market, and that may be done through an aggregator. Essentially, the SRECs are sold based on fluctuating market conditions, and in that model, owners assume the risk for price variability. But the unique part about Massachusetts is they offer a third option. So as Natalie and Mike are going to further explain, Massachusetts offers a public option. I like to think of it as kind of a type of safety net. So if a project owner strikes out everywhere else, they don't decide not to enter a long-term contract and decide not to sell their SRECs on the spot market, they can avail themselves of the public auction. It's referred to as the auction clearinghouse in Massachusetts. And essentially, they can sell their SRECs for a fixed price of $300, of which, after Massachusetts takes an administrative fee, the project owner receives $285. Now, keep in mind, this is referred to as kind of an option of last resort, but all to say, there is kind of a safety net. I think the bottom line in looking at just the way SRECs are sold and when project owners are evaluating this, the bottom line is that, to satisfy underwriting criteria, I think lenders usually prefer long-term fixed price contracts from credit-worthy aggregators, but the public option does provide a safety net and a measure of what the floor of SREC prices will be. So getting into a little more of the specifics of Massachusetts, just a broad overview, and I'm going to turn it over to Natalie and Mike in just a minute, but our team has spent a great deal of time monitoring and keeping up with the trends in the solar market. The state of Massachusetts has been on our radar for a long time. And Massachusetts really took a great deal of time kind of vetting these regulations, and they were just finalized as of December 20th, 2010. So as a result of that, I think we can expect to see a great deal of solar development in Massachusetts in the near term and the coming years. We've done lots of research on the topic, but just a couple outline points. I think, and Natalie and Mike will certainly speak to this, but two of the goals of the Massachusetts program are provide price certainty and flexibility, right? So on the price certainty front, they've established a current alternative compliance payment of $600, and as I mentioned, through the auction clearinghouse, the price floor is $300. So that gives you a sense of what the market will be. And then the opt-in term is currently at 10 years. Now that opt-in term, as I'll let them describe, that's essentially, that gives the project owner the right to participate in the public auction. So all to say, the project owner can't necessarily participate in the auction in perpetuity, but currently there's a 10-year opt-in term, meaning that that kind of safety net will exist for the project owner for 10 years. And then the other thing I want to highlight is just flexibility. The Massachusetts program has mechanisms in place to kind of adjust compliance requirements in future years, and that allows them to create demand for SRECs. In the event that SRECs aren't being sold, Massachusetts has said, hey, we can increase the requirements going forward for the utilities, and kind of voila, we have a market. So that's the extremely broad overview. I want to turn it over to Natalie and Mike and let them explain in further detail.
Hello, this is Natalie. I'll be taking the first half of the presentation here and then have Mike fill in. So today I'm going to give a brief overview of the Massachusetts RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard. I'll talk a little bit about how the solar carve-out was developed, what the goals and objectives of the program are, including updates on the current statistics and the pipeline of projects. Michael will then go over the details, basically, of the program, including how to get qualified, the opt-in term and how that changes, how the program, and basically how the program design supports prices from dropping to $0. And then I'll briefly come back on and cover the Trans-Canada settlement and discuss the New Jersey and Pennsylvania SREC market in comparison to ours. So to get started, if you take a look here at this table, you can see that retail electric suppliers in Massachusetts have to comply with 5 different programs as part of the RPS. The RPS Class 1 and Class 2, and the APS, which is the Alternative Portfolio Standard. The solar carve-out is a subclass of the RPS Class 1 program, and you'll note in the last column, the solar carve-out is the only program in which the alternative compliance payment rate is not tied to the consumer price index. This graph here showing you that after 2008, which was the year in which the Green Communities Act was signed, all these new programs basically were added to the RPS, and the retail electric suppliers had to comply with them. You won't even notice basically the solar carve-out in 2010 and 2011 because it's just so small. You can see it in yellow. But over time, when we reach the program target of 400 megawatts, it'll be about 1% of electricity in Massachusetts coming from solar PV. So the solar carve-out wasn't the first incentive program for solar PV projects in Massachusetts. When Governor Patrick took office in 2007, he set a goal of 250 megawatts by 2017. The first program that we rolled out to help us to get to that goal was called the Commonwealth Solar Program, and that actually launched in, I think, January of 2008, which says December on there, but it was funded with $68 million, and the goal was basically to get us to 27 megawatts installed. And we had figured it would take about 4 years for us to go through that $68 million. And like most rebate programs, it went a lot faster than we expected. So it lasted about 2 years, and it definitely created a strong PV market in Massachusetts and grew the number of jobs here, or at least firms, from like 20 maybe installers to about 150. So we're definitely seeing the success of creating good incentives for solar. And we knew, that the rebate money, there wasn't other funds here to help provide incentive for large projects, so we needed to switch to a market-based incentive. In 2008, the Green Communities Act basically allowed for that to happen. The Green Communities Act included a DG carve-out of the Class 1 program, and it was sort of known that that DG carve-out would be for solar specifically. And essentially all of 2009 was spent with, talking to industry and the compliance entities to develop a strong solar carve-out. We had a lengthy stakeholder process, and the program was launched January 1st of 2010. Small projects are still eligible for a small rebate through the Commonwealth Solar 2 program, and that's up to 10 kW, and only the first 5 kW actually receive, a small 75 cents, I think, per watt rebate. In addition, of course, there's also the federal incentives that help make projects in Massachusetts possible. And this chart here is just showing what the Commonwealth Solar and Stimulus Program, have really helped us to get started, but the growth of the industry is really going to be relying on the solar carve-out, and we're hoping that we're going to get to that 400 megawatt target of PV installed. You'll note that target, the 400, is larger than the governor's goal of 250 megawatts, and that's because when we were going through the stakeholder process, we thought it would, 250 would be too low to really encourage development in Massachusetts, so we set the goal higher because we want to see industry developed and jobs created here. The main goals of the program are to stimulate development of PV across multiple sectors, not just the large megawatt plus projects, but also the residential and commercial projects. We want to reduce the dependence on rebates and minimize the impact to ratepayers, noting that all this is done because we believe strongly in the importance of renewable energy and getting us off of our dependence on fossil fuel, recognizing the jobs and economic and environmental benefits that this program brings to the state. If you take a look on the right-hand side, you can see some statistics, probably, even though we just created this slide, is slightly outdated because we're constantly getting new projects submitted to us and approving them. Over 200 systems have been qualified, and they represent about 17 megawatts of projects. You'll note that only about 4 of that is actually installed in generating SRECs. And, as solar has a seasonal slowdown here in the winter, we're really expecting to see a number of large megawatt scale plus projects coming through in the spring. Installed cost about $5 a watt. For the first 3 quarters of 2010, there were about 1,100 SRECs created. The fourth quarter SRECs won't be minted or created until April 15th of this year, and then we'll know exactly how many SRECs we had for the first year. It's definitely a short market, but we expected that as the program's getting up and going. And for this year, 2011, the compliance obligation for suppliers is 78,000 plus SRECs that need to be generated. And now I'll turn it over to Mike to cover the basics and the details of the program.
All right. This is Mike. I'm going to cover the basics of the program, the process of getting qualified as an eligible unit, and then some of the details on how we make adjustments to the opt-in term and minimum standard. So SRECs are the new primary incentive for solar projects in Massachusetts, and as you may know by now, it's a market-based incentive that's based on production, and it's designed to provide a stream of revenue over a number of years as opposed to an upfront rebate. One SREC is equivalent to 1,000 kilowatt hours or 1 megawatt hour of generation. They have a useful life of 1 year, so if they're generated in 2010, they can only be used for compliance in 2010. And in 2011, the requirement, the program requirement is 69 megawatts of installed capacity. And what that is referring to is we would need 69 megawatts of installed capacity to generate enough SRECs for the market to be in balance. And then we calculate the number of SRECs based on the number of megawatt hours that 69 megawatts would generate in Massachusetts, which we've estimated at around 78,577. And that comes out to about 0.167%, which is then, that is the obligation for each investor-owned utility and competitive retail electric supplier that has an obligation to purchase SRECs. So the buyers in the market are the 4 investor-owned utilities and competitive retail electric suppliers, and about 20 to 24 competitive retail electric suppliers in the state. And the investor-owned utilities are about 50% of the market, and the competitive suppliers are the other 50%. And they each have an obligation to purchase a certain percentage of or a certain percentage of the amount, the total load that they serve in Massachusetts, and that percentage is applied to that load, and then they have to purchase a number of SRECs equivalent to that. Each year, the minimum standard grows 30%. So that is, it's not actually a straight 30% growth rate in a way that most people would think of it, but it's actually 30% of what was installed the previous year. So in 2010, the requirement was 30 megawatts. So 30% of that is approximately 9 megawatts, and then we add that to 30 megawatts. So in 2010, we assumed that the industry could install 30 megawatts, but in 2011, we assumed they could install 39 megawatts. And when you add the two together, that's where you get the 69 megawatts. So if the market remains in perfect balance, which it likely won't necessarily, it would increase each year by about 30%. The ACP rate is $600 per SREC, and this is the rate paid by investor-owned utilities and renewable and competitive retail electric suppliers if they fail to meet their obligation. The auction account allows for buyers or sellers of SRECs to get at least $285 for their SRECs if they're unable to sell them before going to auction. And the overall target for the program is 400 megawatts of installed capacity. So the qualification process. To be eligible, projects need to have a capacity of 6 megawatts or less per parcel of land. So you can only install 6 megawatts on a single contiguous parcel of land. They also have to be located in Massachusetts, and that includes municipal light district territories within the state. They have to use some of their generation on site and be interconnected to the grid. They have to have a commercial operation date later than January 1st, 2008, and they cannot have received additional funding from sources deemed ineligible by DOER. So these sources would include prior rebate programs like the original Commonwealth Solar program or some of its predecessors, or ARRA funds in excess of 67% of the total installed cost of the project. The application is entirely online, and the only thing that you actually need to submit to DOER in hard copy form are a couple signature sheets that will be generated automatically when you're applying. The review process is pretty quick and straightforward. The first-time applicants sometimes have a little bit of difficulty, but it's once you've gone through the process once, it's a very easy and quick process. We can usually get applications turned around within a few weeks if they're submitted complete. So in order to apply, you need to go online and actually register a account and log into our statement of qualification application program online. And this can be found on our website. You just have to fill out a few basic details about yourself and contact information. It will automatically populate that when you're filling out the application. And then most of the application is actually the contact information for the involved parties, but then there's also some specifics about the individual generation units and some other certifications that you need to make while going through the process. So the opt-in term. The opt-in term is every single qualified project is assigned an opt-in term at the time they're qualified. And this sets the length of time that any SRECs the project generates can be deposited into the auction account. So for 2010 and right now, probably through the end of 2011 and beyond, the opt-in term is set at 10 years or 40 quarters. So any project qualified today will be guaranteed to be able to sell their SRECs through the auction account for 40 quarters from the date they're qualified, from the quarter in which they're qualified. And we make yearly adjustments in the opt-in term that only affect new projects. So any project that's been qualified won't have their opt-in term reduced or increased, but newly qualified projects may, depending on what the opt-in term is in that year. So if the market's long, the opt-in term is reduced by 4 quarters for each 10% of the compliance obligation deposited into the auction account. So for 2011, the total compliance obligation is approximately 77,000 megawatt hours. So if 7,000 SRECs were deposited into the auction account, that would trigger a 10% reduction, or that would trigger a 4-quarter reduction in the next year's opt-in term. If the market is short, so meaning ACP compliance is being met through ACP payments, for every 10% that is met through ACP payments, the opt-in term is increased by 4 quarters. But the opt-in term can never go above 10 years or 40 quarters, and will not go below 5 years until at least after 2016, and it's very possible it will never go that low. And in any given year, it cannot increase or decrease by more than 2 years. So the minimum standard, this formula may look a little confusing. It's not that bad, actually. So in 2010 and 2011, the minimum standards were set. Going forward, we calculated based upon the compliance obligation from the previous year and the number of SRECs generated, and then a few other factors such as ACP volume and banking volume and auction volume. So to go through, I put an example on here. So the 2012 minimum standard is equal to the compliance obligation from 2011, which is 78,577 megawatt hours, plus projected SRECs from that will be generated in 2011, minus the number of actual SRECs that were generated in 2010. And then that is actually multiplied by 1.3. That's the 30% growth rate. And then ACP volume is from 2010 is subtracted from that, and banking volume and the auction volume is added to it. So the way that we project the SRECs is we actually have 7 months, but we have to announce it in August, or in July, actually, the following year's minimum standard. And we'll have 7 months of production data up to that point. So we'll have some real data, and then we'll use information we have on the pipeline and the number of qualified projects to project the amount of SRECs that will be generated by the end of the year. And then we actually will know for sure by July the actual number of SRECs generated in 2010. And then we subtract the actual number from the projected number and multiply that by the 30% growth rate. The ACP volume, the reason we subtract it is because that represents a shortage in the market, so we want to slow down growth. So by subtracting it, we're decreasing the minimum standards the following year, less than the 30% growth rate. And then banking volume and auction volume are added because they represent an oversupply in the market. It's unlikely that we'll see that happening this year, but in future years, that could be added, and that would accelerate the growth of the market to account for the oversupply and try to bring everything back into balance. Once 400 megawatts of capacity has been qualified, we won't qualify any future projects, but the market will continue to exist until all opt-in terms of qualified projects have expired. So if the final project is the project that consists of 400 megawatts is qualified, say, in 2017, and the opt-in term at that time is 8 years, the market will last through at least 2025. So projects that are qualified in 2010, 2011, and 12 will have their 10-year opt-in term, which will end, but they'll be able to continue to sell SRECs without the guarantee of going to the auction at the end of the year. So it will likely be selling them for lower prices, but it's all based on what the market price is at the time. So now I'll go through how the auction works. So the auction is really designed as an option of last resort. We want people to go out and get contracts for SRECs and sell them on the spot market in advance. And it really should only be used in years where there's an oversupply, because in other years there should be enough demand for all SRECs to get sold. The auction account opens at the very end of the trading year. So from May 16th to June 15th, the trading year for SRECs ends on June 15th. So by that point in the year, you should know whether or not you're going to be able to sell your SRECs. And at that point in time, you can deposit them into the account. The auction will be held no later than July 31st, and any SRECs that are deposited into the account are reminted as extended life SRECs. So rather than being good for just the compliance year in which they were generated, now they become good for the following compliance year or the year after that. So they become more attractive to the buyers because they can use them for multiple years compliance. Bidders bid on the quantity they want to purchase, not on price, because SRECs are sold to buyers for a fixed price of $300 per megawatt hour before being assessed a $15 megawatt hour auction fee by DOER. So the buyers will bid on a quantity, and then they will pay DOER, DOER will take out the $15 fee and then pay SREC owners. And this is a pretty quick turnaround. I think it should happen. I'm not sure if it actually says in our regulations or not, but it happens within a couple weeks. If the auction fails to clear, meaning not every single SREC was not sold, then it will be held again. And this happens within a couple days. And when it's held again, SRECs are reminted, and this time they have a 3-year shelf life as opposed to 2. If the second auction fails to clear, we increase the minimum standard for the following compliance year and by the number of SRECs that are in the auction, and a third auction is then held a few days later. And this is actually an increase in addition to a previous increase. So part of the formula for increasing the minimum standard is to add the auction volume to the minimum standard for the following year. So say 10,000 SRECs were deposited into the auction account in 2011. The minimum standard for 2012 would then have an additional 10,000 megawatt hours added to it. If the first 2 rounds of the auction fail to clear and it goes to the third round, we then increase it by an additional 10,000. So this is saying to investor-owned utilities and retail electric suppliers that if you don't purchase these SRECs now, you're likely going to have to purchase them next year and do so at a higher price. So it really incentivizes them to buy these SRECs at this point. But in the event that the third auction should fail to clear, SRECs will retain their 3-year shelf life, and then any unsold SRECs will be returned to their owners on a prorated basis. So if you deposited 100 SRECs into the account and only 50% of the auction cleared, 50% of your SRECs will actually sell, but then you get the other 50% returned to you, and they retain that 3-year shelf life. So even though you didn't sell them, they'll likely be the most valuable SRECs out there in the market because they'll have that 3-year shelf life, and you will be able to sell them for 3 years. So it's very, very unlikely that anyone's ever going to be left holding SRECs and not be able to sell them. And DOER is very confident that the auction will clear, hopefully on the first round, and definitely by the third round in every year, if it even needs to be held at all. These are just a few important dates. This list is actually on our website too. Most of them are dates relating to when SRECs are actually created at NEPOOL GIS, and then the other dates are related to often term announcements, when we receive compliance filings, and how the auctions work. A lot of this takes place between July and the end of August, and then the other dates listed in here are mostly the quarterly minting dates. And if you want to look at this, you can always refer back to this presentation, or you can find it on our website as well. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Natalie, and she's going to cover the TransCanada lawsuit from earlier this year and the settlement, and a few other things to close out the presentation.
Thanks, Mike. Okay. Basically, TransCanada filed a complaint in federal court against our program in April of 2010. And what they were alleging is that portions of the Green Communities Act that were intended to increase in-state solar projects were unconstitutional because they favor Massachusetts producers in violation of the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause, if you're not familiar, basically generally prohibits states from enacting laws that burden out-of-state businesses in order to give a competitive advantage to in-state businesses. And essentially the solar carve-out program is only open to projects that are built in Massachusetts, and we're not qualifying projects that are built in New Hampshire or Rhode Island. And this did not go through a legal proceeding. We settled in May of 2010, and the settlement included changes to the program, and specifically the change is that any existing load that competitive retail electric suppliers had before January 1st of 2010, when the program was established, is those existing contracts are exempt from the alternative compliance payment at the $600 level. Instead, they now have to pay the RPS Class 1 ACP level, which is about $60. And, as Mike mentioned earlier, the competitive suppliers are about half of the market here in Massachusetts. So, about half of the load in 2010 will be made through those $60 ACP payments. But going forward, the competitive retail electric suppliers typically only enter into 1 to 3 year contracts. So we'll be seeing the existing load diminish significantly in 2011 and 2012. So they'll be purchasing SRECs for a larger portion of their load. And the last slide to close it out is just basically the Massachusetts program is different from other SREC programs. New Jersey is the state with the second largest number of megawatts installed. They have a very successful SREC program. Unlike Massachusetts, their utilities have basically a way to rate base long-term contracts with the SREC developers, so they'll enter into long-term contracts for PV projects, and we just didn't have that mechanism here. They also have a rolling ACP schedule, so you know for certain 8 years out what the ceiling price for SRECs are going to be. New Jersey has definitely experienced a shortage, so prices have been really high and close to the ACP level. To contrast, in Pennsylvania, they accept projects that are located in Delaware, Illinois, Maryland, Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. So in 2011, their SREC minimum standard or goal is about 33,000 SRECs, but there's about 46,000 SRECs that are registered in Pennsylvania, so there's definitely going to be a long market there, so we should see the SREC prices there decreasing, which is, of course, going to be difficult to get projects built, and where they don't have any sort of floor price, it could significantly shut down and slow the industry. So we were definitely looking in 2009 when we were designing the program to other states and try to figure out what the best practices were to incorporate in our program design.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Bill and Mike and Natalie. And why don't we run to a couple of questions and finish up here. And perhaps kind of as a preliminary matter, it might be useful for Mike or Natalie to give a brief overview, a little more detail on the legislative history and, whether you think there is any risk that the program might be eliminated or suspended or go away. That's kind of a risk that oftentimes developers and lenders ask.
Yeah, I'll take this question. So the Green Communities Act of 2008 allowed for us to establish a DG carve-out and specifically required us to. And DOER subsequently held a lengthy stakeholder process to develop the regulations, and after several revisions were released throughout 2010, the final regulation was actually signed by the Secretary of State earlier this month. So the regulations are fully promulgated and in effect. The legislative risk is similar to pretty much any other policy. The content of the program is regulatory and can be changed by DOER through a regulatory proceeding, which would be public, and we'd have to seek out public comment and take that into consideration. But the actual requirement for a carve-out would require a legislative change. And given the support for renewables in Massachusetts by the legislature and the governor right now, it's possible that something could happen, but I think it's probably unlikely. But there is, as with any other policy, there is some legislative risk that definitely needs to be considered.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Now, a few questions we had regarding the auction price, and that kind of specifically, and maybe Natalie, one that kind of comes up from people is the $300 or the $285 price, is that really a kind of a guaranteed price or a floor price?
Yeah, so we don't like to use the word guaranteed. Our lawyers here have probably ingrained that in us, but it definitely is the mechanism where you're going to get potentially the lowest price for your SRECs, and it's designed so the program does not, as we said, go down to $0 for $10 or something for your SRECs. Should someone want to enter into a contract, a longer-term contract for something less than $285 because they think it has less risk, there's nothing stopping anyone from doing that. But we feel that the auction mechanism is a good bet, and the whole design of the program is geared for someone to get the $285 basic floor price for their SRECs.
As a minimum. So for outside of the auction, you'd kind of expect prices probably to be a little higher than that, generally speaking.
Yeah, and that's what we've heard anecdotally from developers and people that call up to get their projects qualified while we're talking to them on the phone. We've definitely heard of prices in the high 3s and 4s, and spot markets even higher than that. So.
Okay. And Mike, you talked a little about the mechanisms established in the auction to kind of ensure that SRECs, they don't go unsold, qualified SRECs don't go unsold in the 3 rounds of auctions, and kind of the level of attractiveness of the SRECs going up in each round. Do you envision kind of any circumstances where the SRECs would actually not be sold, or is the intent really, that's kind of those are the bites of the apple, and to really get them sold, and there's going to be enough pressure on the electric utilities to do that?
I guess it's possible that someone could have unsold SRECs, but as I said earlier, there are 3 rounds of the auction, and almost all people should be able to sell their SRECs before this. The buyers in the market, in particular the utilities, actually have to go to the Department of Public Utilities before them and argue for rate relief. So if they're not purchasing these SRECs at the lowest price possible, and they're instead just allowing these SRECs to go into auction, not buying them and paying an ACP rate instead, the DPU is probably going to look unfavorably on that. So there's a lot of incentive for them to purchase these SRECs before they even get into the auction. And then once they're in the auction, it really should be the floor price. It's the minimum price they're buying them for. And we make the SRECs more attractive by allowing them to be used for multiple years compliance. And we also have the possible 2 triggers of increasing the minimum standard 2 times.
Yep.
And I think it's very unlikely that any SRECs would ever go unsold unless there's a major oversupply in the market for multiple years.
And is there, maybe on the price as well, Natalie, is there any, will the state of Massachusetts ever step in and buy the SRECs, or is this just going to leave it to the auction process?
Yeah, the state has no intent to buy SRECs, and the design of the auction clearinghouse is a mechanism basically for any unsold SRECs in a long market to be deposited and cleared.
Okay. And with respect to the ACP rate, a couple questions. Do you expect that to stay at $600? It looks like there's some mechanism for it to go down, and I guess kind of combined, would it ever go? Do you expect it to drop below the $300?
Below 300.
Yeah.
I don't. Were you asking about whether it be reduced below 600 too, or?
Yeah, I guess it's at 600. It looks like it can drop kind of normally, annually. Is that something? I guess is that just going to be determined kind of year by year, depending on where the supply is?
Yeah, it is one of the few things in the regulations that we actually still have some discretion over. Almost everything is done by formula, and we maintain the discretion to reduce the ACP rate by no more than 10% annually, and we'll make an announcement of any changes by the end of January each year. And if we do end up reducing it, we will justify our decision to do so. And as far as going below 300, I mean, I don't think that we have any intention to reduce the ACP rate below that, because it really doesn't make much sense for us to put the ACP rate less than the floor price of the program.
Okay, and then a couple more questions, and we'll wrap up. And Natalie, a few people have shown a little or asked questions about what happens after the opt-in term. So after the 10 years, can you still sell, or can the project still sell SRECs?
Mm-hmm. So I think Mike covered this in the presentation, but I'll just reiterate that the end of the program is when all of the projects that have been qualified, when their opt-in terms have been met. So for projects that are getting started, at the beginning of the program, more than likely they'll end up continuing to generate SRECs beyond their opt-in term, and they just won't have the option of putting any excess SRECs that aren't sold into the auction account. They'll be able to sell them, in the market until the program has met all of those opt-in terms. And then once the program does end and all of the opt-in terms have been met, projects will still generate RECs, and it will just be on the RPS Class 1 REC market. It's hard to say what that rate would be, but it's, increased annually on the Consumer Price Index.
So the SRECs still can be sold, but probably they might just be RECs and they might be at a lower price. And I guess it wouldn't have the auction mechanism to kind of back it up.
Right, but if the market's still strong and, there's a shortage in 1 year, you would still be able to expect, higher than auction prices for your SRECs.
Okay. And last couple of questions, just on the 400 megawatt cap, how is that determined? Is that first come, first served, just through the online application?
Yep, the 400 megawatt cap is first come, first serve. We're accepting projects. Typically, people don't apply until they're close to their interconnection. Mm-hmm. And for projects that are greater than 1 megawatt, we had some changes in the regulations that came out recently to say that they need to have their state permits in order. So they're if it's a building permit or electrical permit, because at the end of this program, we don't want a buildup or queue of projects that aren't real. So we had to add something to it to encourage folks, don't submit your application until you're ready. And the other thing is when you submit your application and you're qualified, you're given your opt-in term in quarters, and if the clock starts ticking, if you're qualified and you don't actually get constructed for a year, you're going to start losing your opt-in term, which won't really make a big difference until the out years, but we don't encourage people to apply until they're good and ready.
Is there a mechanism for projects that are delayed or not being built, other than just eating into their own opt-in term, which could hurt their project? Is there any other mechanism to kind of remove them from the pool?
Yeah, I think in our regulations, after 2 years, basically you have to reapply.
Okay, and so if there's a project that's qualified, doesn't get built within that period of time,
then they're kicked out basically, and they have to apply again.
Okay, and whatever they had qualified for goes back into the pool.
Yep.
Okay. All right, so I think that answers most of the questions. There's a couple additional ones which we can kind of get back to the individuals asking that. But thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much, Natalie and Bill. And I think that wraps us up.